Did you know the tallest mountain in the world isn't Everest? It's in Alaska. And the math that proves it has been sitting in plain sight for decades. Or that the highest wind speed ever recorded on Earth happened on a mountain in New Hampshire, not in a hurricane, not in a tornado, just a Tuesday in April. How about the fact that one state's highest point is actively growing taller right now, pushed up by geological forces that added 4 feet in a single afternoon? Every state in America has a highest point. Some of them hold records that belong to the entire planet. Today, we're breaking down the tallest mountain in every US state, all 50 of them, and the records will surprise you more than the elevations. Alabama, Cheaha Mountain, 2,413 feet. Cheaha is the highest point in Alabama and the lowest state high point east of the Mississippi River that still qualifies as an actual mountain. The name comes from the Creek word meaning high place, which is either poetic or optimistic, depending on your reference frame. The summit sits inside Cheaha State Park, which built an observation tower on top because the trees otherwise block the view entirely. Without the tower, you wouldn't know you were at the top of Alabama. The mountain is part of the Talladega National Forest and sits on a spine of the Appalachians so old, the rock itself, Hillaby Greenstone, formed over 500 million years ago, when this part of Alabama was on the seafloor of a vanished ocean. Alabama's tallest mountain is ancient, modest, and requires a man-made tower to see over itself. Alaska, Denali, 20,310 feet. Denali is not just the tallest mountain in the United States. It is the tallest mountain in the world, when measured from base to summit, rather than from sea level, rising 18,000 feet from its base in a single, continuous ascent. Everest rises 12,000 feet from its Tibetan Plateau base. Denali rises from lowlands near sea level. The mountain generates its own weather systems. Temperatures at the summit have been recorded at -75 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill. The summit sits at such high latitude that the altitude is physiologically equivalent to several thousand feet higher at equatorial mountains, meaning climbers need acclimatization profiles designed specifically for Denali's unique combination of cold and altitude. The first confirmed summit was reached in 1913 by Hudson Stuck and 3 companions, one of whom, Walter Harper, a native Athabascan, stepped to the top first. Alaska's highest mountain is the most physically demanding ascent in North America, and it isn't close. Arizona, Humphreys Peak, 12,633 feet. Humphreys Peak is the remnant of a volcano that destroyed itself. The San Francisco Peaks, of which Humphreys is the highest point, are what remains after a massive volcanic collapse roughly 400,000 years ago blew the top off a mountain that scientists estimate was once 15,000 to 16,000 feet tall. What exists today is the eroded rim of a caldera that used to be a summit. The Hopi and Navajo nations consider the peaks sacred, the home of the Kachina spirits and the Diin Dene, respectively. A ski resort operates on the mountain's lower slopes, a fact that generated decades of legal battles over development on sacred land. Arizona's tallest mountain is a collapsed volcano considered sacred by multiple indigenous nations, and it is being skied on. Mount Magazine, 2,753 feet. Mount Magazine is a flat-topped sandstone mesa, a geological feature called a cuesta, with a summit plateau broad enough to contain a state park lodge, several campsites, and a hang-gliding launch point. The mountain's flat top is not a coincidence of erosion. It is a remnant of a once continuous sandstone layer that covered the entire region and has been stripped away everywhere except here, where the resistant cap rock protected the softer material below it. From the summit, the Arkansas River Valley spreads below in a view that makes the modest elevation feel grander than the number suggests. Arkansas's tallest mountain isn't a peak at all. It is a table, a flat piece of ancient seafloor held up by a cap of harder rock while everything around it slowly disappeared. California, Mount Whitney, 14,505 feet. Mount Whitney is the tallest mountain in the contiguous United States, and sits 84.6 miles from Badwater Basin in Death Valley, the lowest point in North America, at minus 282 feet. The two extremes of American elevation are visible from each other on clear days. Whitney's summit is reached by a trail so heavily used that the National Forest Service instituted a permit lottery system limiting daily visitors, and human waste at elevation became a serious enough environmental issue that the park now requires hikers to pack out their waste in specialized bags. The mountain was named after Josiah Whitney, the California state geologist, who ironically did not believe the peak named for him was the tallest in the range. He was wrong. California's highest mountain is the top of the lower 48, visible from the bottom of it. Colorado, Mount Elbert, 14,440 feet. Colorado has 58 peaks over 14,000 feet, called Fortiners, and Mount Elbert is the tallest of all of them by a margin of 12 feet over Mount Massive, its nearest competitor. The two mountains are visible from each other's summit. Elbert's summit is reached by a trail that is technically non-technical, meaning no ropes or special equipment are required, but the altitude, the distance, and the afternoon lightning storms that build over the Rockies with the reliability of a timetabled event kill people on this mountain every year. Colorado's tallest mountain is the tallest easy mountain in America and treats the distinction with indifference. Connecticut, Bear Mountain, 2,316 feet. Connecticut's highest point has an asterisk. Bear Mountain is the highest summit entirely within the state, but the highest land in Connecticut is actually on the southern slope of Mount Frizzle, whose summit is in Massachusetts. The distinction matters to high pointers, who must stand on the actual highest ground, regardless of where the summit is. Connecticut's true high point is therefore a slope, not a top, a situation that produces a specific kind of geographic comedy in a state already working with modest vertical ambitions. Bear Mountain itself is a pleasant Appalachian summit with a stone monument at the top and views of 3 states. Connecticut's tallest mountain is not entirely sure it's Connecticut's tallest mountain, and the people whose hobby requires clarity on this matter have been arguing about it for decades. Delaware, Ebright Azimuth, 448 feet. The highest point in Delaware is a road junction in a residential neighborhood in Wilmington. There is a survey marker embedded in the ground and a small sign. The sign has been stolen multiple times and repeatedly replaced. Nearby houses have been sold, with the sales listing noting their proximity to the state high point as a feature. High pointers who complete Delaware as part of their 50-state challenge describe the experience as requiring the suppression of expectation to a degree that is itself a form of achievement. Delaware's highest point is not a mountain. It is not a hill in any meaningful sense. It is the place where the land stops rising before it meets Pennsylvania. And it has a sign, when the sign hasn't been stolen, to prove it. Florida, Britton Hill, 345 feet. The lowest state high point in America is in the Florida Panhandle, and it is, technically, a gentle rise in a landscape of longleaf pine forest that gives no visual indication it is the highest ground in the state. There is a picnic area. There is a marker. The high pointers who visit Britton Hill on their way to more demanding summits describe it with the specific affection reserved for something that has no pretensions about what it is. Florida also contains Sugarloaf Mountain near Lake Wales, which at 312 feet bills itself as a mountain and runs a ski slope in winter using artificial snow. Florida's tallest actual high point is lower than the artificial ski slope on a hill that is not even the highest point in the state. The arithmetic of Florida's vertical ambitions is consistent throughout. Georgia, Brasstown Bald, 4,784 feet. Brasstown Bald is the only Georgia summit with a 360-degree view, achieved by clearing the summit of trees and building an observation deck. The mountain's name comes from a mistranslation. The Cherokee name, Itsei, means place of fresh green grass, which early settlers misread as a reference to brass or bald. The summit is bald not by geology but by maintenance. Left alone, the summit would reforest within decades. Georgia actively keeps it clear. The mountain is also the location of a National Weather Service station that has been continuously recording weather data since 1964, meaning Brasstown Bald has one of the longest continuous weather records of any peak in the southern Appalachians. Georgia's tallest mountain is a summit kept deliberately bare, named by a mistranslation, that has been watching the weather for 60 years. Hawaii, Mauna Kea, 13,796 feet. Mauna Kea is the tallest mountain on Earth measured from its base. It rises 33,500 feet from the Pacific Ocean floor, nearly 14,000 feet of that above sea level, with the remaining 19,700 feet below the waterline. The summit is so high and so consistently clear of atmospheric interference that it hosts 13 telescopes from 9 countries, the highest concentration of major observatories on Earth. The mountain is sacred to native Hawaiians as the meeting place of Sky Father, Wakea, and Earth Mother, Papahanaumoku. The construction of a 14th telescope, the 30-meter telescope, triggered years of protest and legal battles over development on sacred land. Hawaii's tallest mountain is simultaneously the world's best astronomical observation site, a sacred indigenous landscape, and an active argument about who gets to decide what a mountain is for. Idaho, Bora Peak, 12,662 feet. Bora Peak gained 4 feet on October 28, 1983. The magnitude 6.9 Bora Peak earthquake, the largest in Idaho's recorded history, uplifted the mountain by enough to change its surveyed elevation from 12,655 to 12,662 feet. A fault scarp 21 miles long and up to 14 feet high appeared along the base of the Lost River Range overnight. 2 people died, not from the mountain itself, but from a school building in Challis, 60 miles away, that collapsed during the shaking. The mountain's standard route, called the Chicken Out Ridge, involves a knife-edge scramble that stops a significant percentage of hikers who attempt it. Idaho's tallest mountain grew in an earthquake, has a ridge specifically named for the people it turns back, and is in a range called the Lost River. Illinois, Charles Mound, 1,235 feet. Charles Mound is on private farmland in Joe Davis County, and the landowners, the Weebles family, open the property to high pointers on specific weekends per year. Access is by permission only. The summit is a gentle rise in an agricultural landscape with a survey marker and views of the rolling hills of the Driftless area, a region that the last glaciation missed entirely, leaving a landscape of valleys and ridges in a state otherwise defined by glacial flatness. Illinois' highest point requires an appointment, operates on a schedule set by a farm family, and sits in the part of the state that Glacius forgot. The entire High Point experience is a negotiation between a hobby and a property line. Indiana, Hoosier Hill, 1,257 feet. Hoosier Hill sits in a soybean field in Randolph County. The landowners, for years a family named Goebel, maintained a trail, a guest book, and a mailbox at the summit for visiting high pointers. The guest book entries span decades of visitors, describing their experience in terms that oscillate between earnest appreciation and barely suppressed laughter at what Indiana has offered as its highest achievement. The land changed ownership in recent years, and access arrangements shifted accordingly, a recurring reality of high-pointing states where the summit is someone's agricultural property. Indiana's tallest mountain is a modest rise in farmland, but was cared for by a family who understood that some people needed it to mean something, and accommodated that need with a mailbox. Iowa, Hawkeye Point, 1,670 feet. Hawkeye Point is in a cornfield in Osceola County, near the Minnesota border, and is accessed by walking through an agricultural landscape with no trail. The point itself is marked by a small monument and a register box. It is so flat and so undistinguished that the highest point in Iowa is essentially invisible until you are standing on it. Iowa's Driftless area in the northeast contains much more dramatic terrain, with bluffs and valleys that look and feel far more like mountains than the actual high point. Iowa's tallest mountain proves that elevation and drama have nothing to do with each other, that the highest ground in a state can be the least conspicuous feature in the landscape, and that a cornfield can contain a summit if the surrounding state is flat enough. Kansas. Mount Sunflower, 4,039 feet. Mount Sunflower is a wheat field in Wallace County with a steel sunflower sculpture welded to a fence post at the summit to mark the location. The sculpture was made by the landowners, Ed and Cindy Harold, who welcome visitors and have created a small monument site around the marker. The Harolds receive thousands of visitors per year to a wheat field. Mount Sunflower is 17 feet higher than the Colorado border it stands near, which is the margin by which Kansas beats Colorado to the punch at this specific longitude. The Rocky Mountain Front Range is visible on exceptionally clear days from the summit, a mountain range viewed from a wheat field monument welded to a fence post. Kansas's tallest mountain is a destination built by its owners out of the understanding that people needed it to be one. Kentucky, Black Mountain, 4,145 feet. Black Mountain sits on the Virginia border in Harlan County, directly above the coal fields that defined Appalachian Kentucky for a century. The summit is on private property owned by a coal company, a situation that has complicated high pointer access for decades, with access policies that have changed as ownership has transferred. The mountain's most significant feature is what it sits above. The communities of Harlan County, visible from the summit, are the same communities documented in Barbara Koppel's Harlan County, USA, the 1976 documentary about the coal miners' strike that became one of the most important labor films ever made. Kentucky's tallest mountain is a coal company's property, sitting above the most famous labor battleground in Appalachian history. Louisiana, Driscoll Mountain, 535 feet. Driscoll Mountain is a forested hill in Bienville Parish that rises so gradually from the surrounding pine flatlands that the summit requires a GPS or a trail marker to locate with confidence. The trail is short. The climb is minimal. The summit contains a monument and a register that high pointers sign with the specific satisfaction of completing a state that makes no vertical demands whatsoever. Louisiana's real geographical claim is not its elevation, but its absolute lack of it. The state averages 8 feet above sea level. Large portions of New Orleans are below it. The highest point in Louisiana is lower than the levees protecting the lowest neighborhoods. Louisiana's tallest mountain is a reminder that a state's geography is defined by where it is, not by what it rises to. Maine, Mount Katahdin, 5,268 feet. Katahdin is the northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail, the point where 2,190 miles of walking either ends or begins, depending on your direction of travel. The summit, called Baxter Peak, is reached by the Knife Edge, a ridge trail so narrow in sections that hikers straddle it with their feet on both sides simultaneously, with drops of over 1,000 feet on each side. The mountain rises in isolation from the surrounding lowlands of Baxter State Park, with no neighboring peaks to diminish it, a solitary massif that looks like exactly what it is, the hardest thing in Maine. Governor Percival Baxter bought the land himself after the Maine legislature refused to create a park here, then donated it to the state. Maine's tallest mountain was given to the public by one man who decided the legislature's answer was wrong. Maryland, Hoy Crest, 3,360 feet. Hoy Crest sits on the Maryland Panhandle, a narrow extension of the state between Pennsylvania and West Virginia, so geographically isolated from the rest of Maryland that most Marylanders have never been there. The summit is in Garrett County, accessible by a trail through Swallow Falls State Park, and named for Carroll Hoy, a local surveyor. The Panhandle itself is a political artifact of the Civil War era, a strip of territory that Maryland retained when Virginia seceded, maintained as a geographic afterthought of boundary negotiations. Maryland's tallest mountain is in the part of Maryland that doesn't feel like Maryland. On a summit named after a surveyor, reachable only by driving through a panhandle that exists because of a war. Massachusetts, Mount Greylock, 3,491 feet. Mount Greylock's summit contains a 93-foot war memorial tower and a historic lodge, Bascom Lodge, built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s and still operating. Herman Melville wrote much of Moby Dick while looking at Greylock from his farm in Pittsfield, describing the mountain's profile as resembling a sperm whale breaking the surface. Henry David Thoreau climbed it and slept at the summit, writing about waking above the clouds. Nathaniel Hawthorne visited. Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote a poem about it. Massachusetts's tallest mountain is the most literary peak in America, a summit so embedded in 19th-century New England writing that climbing it feels less like outdoor recreation and more like entering a footnote. Michigan, Mount Arvin, 1,979 feet. Michigan's highest point was disputed for decades. Mount Arvin and Curwood Castle, a neighboring summit, traded the title of state high point multiple times as survey precision improved. The official determination in favor of Arvin came in 1982 after a resurvey, and Curwood supporters, who existed, had to accept the outcome. Arvin is in the Upper Peninsula, in Barriga County, accessible by Forest Road and a short walk through hardwood forest. Michigan has two peninsulas, nearly 3,300 miles of Great Lakes shoreline, and a high point that took 20th century surveying technology to identify definitively. Michigan's tallest mountain spent decades not being sure it was the tallest mountain. Minnesota, Eagle Mountain, 2,301 feet. Eagle Mountain is in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, reachable only on foot or by canoe and portage, which means completing Minnesota's high point requires wilderness navigation skills that most state high points don't demand. The summit sits in the same geological terrain as the Canadian Shield, ancient rock exposed by glaciation, with views of lakes stretching into Canada. The trail passes through boreal forest, typical of a latitude much farther north. Minnesota's high point is in the most protected wilderness in the eastern United States, requires a permit to access, and gives the distinct impression that the mountain doesn't especially want visitors, and has arranged the logistics accordingly. Mississippi, Woodall Mountain, 806 feet. Woodall Mountain is a forested hill in Tishomingo County in the state's northeastern corner, in the same anomalous Appalachian foothill terrain that makes that corner of Mississippi look nothing like the rest of the state. The summit is accessible by a paved road that drives nearly to the top, making it one of the most accessible state high points in the country. A radio transmission tower occupies the summit. High pointers describe the experience as quick, easy, and accompanied by the sound of radio equipment. Mississippi's tallest mountain is a forested hill with a tower on top, in the part of Mississippi that forgot to be flat, reachable by car, unremarkable by any measure, except the one that makes it the highest point in a state, with 800 feet of vertical ambition. Missouri, Tom Sauk Mountain, 1,772 feet. Tom Sauk is the highest point in the St. Francois Mountains, a range of igneous rock in the Missouri Ozarks so ancient it predates the Appalachians by hundreds of millions of years. The summit is in a state park and accessible by a short trail. In 2005, the Tom Sauk Reservoir at the mountain's summit failed catastrophically when an operator error caused it to overflow and the earthen dam collapsed, releasing 1.3 billion gallons of water down the mountain in minutes. The Johnson's Shut-ins State Park below was largely destroyed. Miraculously, no one died. Missouri's tallest mountain contained a reservoir that failed. The dam was rebuilt and is operating again, meaning the highest point in Missouri is currently holding 1 billion gallons of water over the valley below it again. Montana, Granite Peak, 12,799 feet. Granite Peak is the most technically difficult state high point in the contiguous United States. It requires a rope, climbing hardware, route-finding ability, and a weather window that the peak itself makes difficult to predict. The mountain generates its own storms with such frequency that summit attempts are measured in days of commitment rather than hours. The summit was not reached until 1923, later than many peaks of greater height in the same region, because the difficulty is not elevation, but terrain. Loose granite, exposed ridges, and mandatory technical climbing combine on a summit that turns back the majority of people who attempt it. Montana's tallest mountain is the peak that high pointers attempting all 50 states list most often as the one that stopped them. Nebraska, Panorama Point, 5,424 feet. Panorama Point is in a wheat field in Kimball County with a small monument and a 360-degree view of nothing in particular except flat agricultural land in all directions. It is higher in elevation than most of Colorado's metropolitan area, higher than Denver, higher than half of Colorado's cities, because Nebraska's panhandle sits on the high plains at the base of the Rockies. Nebraska's highest point is only a mountain in the sense that it is the highest ground in the state. It is actually a plateau, an edge of the Great Plains, a place where the land just stops going higher before Colorado takes over. Nebraska's tallest mountain is proof that elevation and landscape are different arguments made by different parts of the same country. Nevada, Boundary Peak, 13,147 feet. Boundary Peak sits on the Nevada-California border, and its status as Nevada's high point has been legally questioned because the peak is a sub-peak of Montgomery Peak in California, connected by a ridge that dips below the Nevada-California state line. If the definition of a state high point requires an independent summit, Boundary Peak fails the test. If it requires only the highest ground within the state boundary, it qualifies. Nevada's high point is a mountain whose claim to the title depends on which definition of summit you accept, a philosophical question in geology that Nevada has been ignoring pragmatically since surveyors drew the line where they drew it. New Hampshire, Mount Washington, 6,288 feet. Mount Washington held the world record for surface wind speed from 1934 until 1996, 231 miles per hour. The summit has recorded conditions so severe that the staff of the Mount Washington Observatory, who live at the summit year-round, coined a phrase for the mountain's weather: the worst weather in the world. The summit has a hotel, a weather station, a museum, a broadcast tower, and a cog railway that has been carrying tourists to the top since 1869. It also kills people. The mountain's combination of rapidly changing weather, exposure, and visitor overconfidence produces fatalities in every season. A marker near the summit lists the dead going back over a century. New Hampshire's tallest mountain holds the world wind record, has a hotel on its summit, and has been killing unprepared visitors for 150 years without adjusting its attitude. New Jersey, high point, 1,803 feet. High Point is named with the directness that New Jersey's geography supports without embarrassment. A 220-foot war memorial obelisk sits at the summit, visible for miles, making the highest point in New Jersey also one of its most conspicuous landmarks. The surrounding High Point State Park contains a lake, camping, and trail access to the Appalachian Trail, which crosses the summit. On clear days, the view extends to the New York City skyline in one direction and the Delaware Water Gap in another. New Jersey is the most densely populated state in America. Its highest point is a public park with a war memorial on top. New Jersey's tallest mountain contains multitudes, which is the most New Jersey thing about it. New Mexico, Wheeler Peak, 13,161 feet. Wheeler Peak is inside the Wheeler Peak Wilderness in the Taos Mountains, above a region that has been sacred to the Taos Pueblo people for over 1,000 years. The Taos Pueblo itself, still inhabited, sits at the base of the mountain, and its residents consider Wheeler and the surrounding peaks the source of the sacred Blue Lake, returned to Pueblo ownership by Congress in 1970 in a landmark Native American land rights decision. The summit is reached by a trail that passes through forests of bristlecone pine, some of them over 1,000 years old. New Mexico's tallest mountain rises above the oldest continuously inhabited community in North America and was fought over legally for 64 years before the people who had always considered it theirs got it back. New York, Mount Marcy, 5,344 feet. Mount Marcy is the source of the Hudson River, which flows 315 miles south to New York Harbor, where it becomes one of the most commercially significant waterways in American history. The trickle, leaving the summit bog called Lake Tear of the Clouds, is the farthest upstream source of a river that defined the economy and culture of the northeastern United States for centuries. The mountain was climbed by Theodore Roosevelt in 1901, when a messenger reached him on the summit with word that President McKinley was dying. Roosevelt descended and rode through the night to reach the railroad and became President of the United States somewhere on that trail. New York's tallest mountain is where the Hudson River begins, and where a president's journey to the White House ended. North Carolina, Mount Mitchell, 6,684 feet. Mount Mitchell is the highest peak east of the Mississippi River, by a margin large enough to be definitive. It is named after Elisha Mitchell, who spent years arguing that it was the highest peak in the eastern United States, fell to his death from a waterfall on the mountain while trying to verify his measurements, and was subsequently buried at the summit. His rival, Thomas Klingman, who disputed the measurements and has a peak in Tennessee named after him, lived to see Mitchell vindicated and memorialized on the mountain he died proving was the tallest. North Carolina's highest peak has a scientist buried at its summit, who died establishing that it was the highest. The mountain agreed to mark the occasion. North Dakota, White Butte, 3,506 feet. White Butte is a badlands formation in the southwestern part of the state, accessible by crossing private ranch land with the permission of the Assumed family, who own it and have provided access to high pointers for decades. The butte rises from the surrounding prairie in the layered clay and sedimentary colors of the North Dakota Badlands, requiring no technical skill, but offering an exposure to open sky and wind that the surrounding landscape provides without mercy. North Dakota's high point is on a ranch, accessible by permission, in a badlands landscape that most people associate with South Dakota. North Dakota's tallest mountain is the better-kept secret of the two Dakotas, seen by fewer people, cared for by one family. Ohio, Campbell Hill, 1,549 feet. Campbell Hill is on the grounds of a technical college in Bellefontaine, Ohio, a detail that has made it one of the most institutionally managed state high points in the country. The campus is open to visitors, and the summit is marked, maintained, and surrounded by parking. Ohio's highest point is accessed through a college campus, which is either extremely convenient or slightly deflating, depending on your expectations. The hill itself is a glacial deposit, pushed into position by the Laurentide ice sheet, and left there when the glacier retreated 12,000 years ago. Ohio's tallest mountain is a pile of material left by a glacier on a college campus in a town called Bellefontaine, which is French for beautiful fountain. The French named it. The glacier built it. Oklahoma, Black Mesa, 4,973 feet. Black Mesa is a lava-capped tableland in the Oklahoma Panhandle, as far from the Oklahoma of the national imagination as it is possible to get while remaining in the state. The black basalt caprock was deposited by lava flows from New Mexico volcanoes 30 million years ago. Dinosaur tracks are visible in the Morrison Formation, exposed below the mesa, discovered in the 1980s and documented as a significant paleontological site. The Panhandle itself is the result of the Missouri Compromise's boundary lines, leaving a strip of land that no territory officially claimed when Oklahoma became a state. Oklahoma's tallest mountain is a lava-capped dinosaur track site in a panhandle that exists because of a 19th century political boundary drawing exercise. Oregon, Mount Hood, 11,239 feet. Mount Hood is the most climbed glaciated peak in the world after Japan's Mount Fuji, with approximately 10,000 summit attempts per year. It is an active stratovolcano whose last significant eruption was in the 1780s, before Lewis and Clark saw it. The mountain has 12 named glaciers. The Timberline Lodge at its base, built by the CCC in 1937, was used as the exterior of the Overlook Hotel in Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. The summit's crater rim is still thermally active, emitting enough heat that climbers have sheltered in steam vents during storms, a survival technique documented since the 1800s. Oregon's tallest mountain is a volcano with an active crater, a ski resort, and a Kubrick film credit, sitting above a city of 600,000 people within its blast radius. Pennsylvania, Mount Davis, 3,213 feet. Mount Davis is in Forbes State Forest in Somerset County, a forested summit with an observation tower built to see over the trees that would otherwise obscure the view from the top. The mountain is named after John Nelson Davis, a naturalist who homesteaded on the summit area in the 19th century and whose advocacy helped preserve the land. The summit has a unique local distinction. It is visited by a higher percentage of Pennsylvania's high pointers during hunting season than any other time of year, because Forbes State Forest is active hunting land and the trailhead functions as an access point. Pennsylvania's tallest mountain is a forested summit with a tower to see over itself, named after a homesteader popular with hunters. Rhode Island, Jerimoth Hill, 812 feet. Jerimoth Hill was for years one of the most difficult state high points to access, not because of its terrain, it is a gentle wooded rise, but because it is on private property, and the former owner, Henry Richardson, actively discouraged visitors to the point of confrontation. High pointers attempting Rhode Island's summit in the 1990s reported being turned away, threatened, and in some cases, chased. Richardson died in 2001, and access improved significantly. The summit is now accessible via a short trail and is the most anticlimactic terrain achievement in New England. Rhode Island's tallest mountain is a small hill that was harder to reach due to a hostile landowner than due to any physical challenge, making it legendary among high pointers for entirely human reasons. South Carolina, Sassafras Mountain, 3,553 feet. Sassafras Mountain sits on the North Carolina border in Pickens County and was essentially inaccessible for recreational hikers for decades because it sat on Duke Energy property. The utility company began allowing access in the 2000s, and the state eventually developed a proper trail and overlook. The Summit Observation Platform, completed in 2019, offers views of 4 states on clear days. The mountain is named for the sassafras trees that cover its slopes, whose roots were historically used to make root beer before the FDA banned safrole, the compound that gives sassafras its flavor. South Carolina's tallest mountain was locked behind a power company's fence for most of modern history, is named for a tree whose flavor was banned by the federal government, and now has an observation deck. South Dakota, Harney Peak, 7,242 feet. Now Black Elk Peak. The name was officially changed to Black Elk Peak in 2016 to honor Nicholas Black Elk, the Oglala Lakota holy man whose visions on the summit were documented in Black Elk Speaks, one of the most significant accounts of Native American spiritual life ever recorded. Black Elk climbed the peak in 1931 at age 68 and described his vision of the sacred hoop of the world from its summit. The stone fire lookout tower at the top was built in 1938 and is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The peak is in the Black Hills, the land taken from the Lakota Nation by the United States in violation of the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. South Dakota's tallest mountain was renamed to honor a man whose people were dispossessed of the mountain he considered sacred. Tennessee, Clingman's Dome, 6,643 feet. Clingman's Dome is the highest point on the Appalachian Trail, the highest point in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and the highest point in Tennessee. 3 records for one summit. The observation tower at the top, a concrete spiral ramp that looks like a flying saucer designed in 1959, was built because the Fraser fir and red spruce forest at the summit is so dense it blocks all views. The Fraser firs are dying from an invasive pest called the balsam woolly adelgid, introduced accidentally from Europe in the early 20th century, and have been dying since the 1960s. The forest at the summit is being replaced by standing dead timber as the living trees are systematically killed. Tennessee's tallest mountain is the highest point of the most walked trail in America, topped by a 1959 concrete spaceship watching its forest die. Texas. Guadalupe Peak, 8,749 feet. Guadalupe Peak is in the Guadalupe Mountains National Park, a park so rarely visited that it regularly appears on lists of the least visited national parks in the country, despite its location near El Paso and its geological significance. The mountain is the exposed reef of an ancient Permian Sea, a 265-million-year-old marine ecosystem lifted 9,000 feet into the desert air by tectonic forces. The Guadalupe Mountains contain the world's most extensive and best-preserved Permian Reef fossil record. The summit is reached by the Guadalupe Peak Trail, a rigorous day hike with significant elevation gain and no water sources. Texas's tallest mountain is the top of a fossil reef in the least visited major national park in the state, and it is routinely overlooked by a state that tends to overlook the things in its far west corner. Utah, Kings Peak, 13,528 feet. Kings Peak is in the high Uintas Wilderness, the only major mountain range in the contiguous United States that runs east-west rather than north-south, a geological orientation that makes it an anomaly in the Rocky Mountain system. The peak requires a 28-mile round-trip hike through wilderness with multiple river crossings, no reliable trail in sections, and a summit approach that involves boulder fields at altitude. Utah is so full of dramatic landscape that Kings Peak, a demanding wilderness summit at over 13,000 feet, is not among the state's most famous geographic features. The Grand Canyon of the Colorado, Zion, Bryce, Arches, Canyonlands, all compete for attention. Utah's tallest mountain is the overlooked giant of a state, with too many giants to pay attention to all of them. Vermont, Mount Mansfield, 4,393 feet. Mount Mansfield's summit ridge is named in sections for the features of a human face seen in profile from the valley below: the forehead, the nose, the upper lip, the chin. The profile is convincing enough to have been the defining landmark of the Champlain Valley for as long as the valley has been inhabited. The summit ridge runs for over a mile above treeline, rare in Vermont, and supports a community of Arctic alpine plants, more typical of Labrador than New England, species that have survived at this elevation since the glacial retreat by remaining adapted to conditions colder than the surrounding mountains. Vermont's tallest mountain has a face. It has been the face of Vermont since before Vermont was Vermont, and the plants on its forehead are from the Ice Age. Virginia, Mount Rogers, 5,729 feet. Mount Rogers is the highest point in Virginia, and the summit is in a forest so dense that it is one of the few state high points with no view from the top. Hikers reach the summit marker, stand in the trees, confirm their arrival by GPS, and turn around. The mountain is on the Appalachian Trail, and the surrounding highland plateau is grazed by wild ponies, a feral herd managed by the Wilburn Ridge Pony Association, whose presence on the open balds adjacent to the summit makes the approach to Virginia's highest mountain feel significantly more mythological than the treed summit delivers. Virginia's tallest mountain promises ponies on the way up and shows you trees at the top. Most hikers agree the ponies were the better part. Washington, Mount Rainier, 14,000 411 feet. Mount Rainier is the most glaciated peak in the contiguous United States, holding more glacial ice than all other Cascade peaks combined. It is also a stratovolcano, classified by the USGS as a decade volcano, one of 16 volcanoes worldwide identified as warranting intensive study due to their potential for large, destructive eruptions near populated areas. The primary hazard is not lava, but lahar, a volcanic mudflow. In the event of a major eruption, lahars could reach Tacoma and parts of the Seattle metro area within hours. The mountain is visible from Seattle on clear days, which is beautiful, and sits above 80,000 people within the highest-risk lahar zones, which is the other thing. Washington's tallest mountain is the most beautiful and most dangerous neighbor the Pacific Northwest has. West Virginia, Spruce Knob, 4,863 feet. Spruce Knob is the highest point in the Allegheny Mountains, and the highest point in any state east of the Mississippi south of New Hampshire, a set of qualifiers that reflect how the Appalachian elevation record works. The summit is above treeline, due not to altitude, but to wind exposure so consistent and so fierce that trees on the western slope grow permanently bent to the east, pointing in the direction the wind goes. Red spruce forest covers the approach, and the wind-sculpted Krumholtz at the summit looks transplanted from a subalpine zone several thousand feet higher. West Virginia's tallest mountain has trees that grow sideways because the wind has been making its point for longer than anyone has been there to hear it. Wisconsin, Timms Hill, 1,951 feet. Timms Hill is in Price County, in the northern Wisconsin woods, a glacial drumlin in a landscape of lakes and boreal forest, accessible by a well-maintained trail with an observation tower at the summit. It is the only Wisconsin high point, and the experience of climbing it is pleasant, uncomplicated, and satisfying in the way that things built specifically to be pleasant and uncomplicated and satisfying tend to be. Wisconsin maintains it well. The tower works. The view is of the lake country spreading below, and the forest running to the horizon. Wisconsin's tallest mountain is not trying to be something it isn't, which is an underrated quality in both mountains and states. Wyoming, Gannett Peak, 13,804 feet. Gannett Peak is the most remote state high point in the lower 48. Reaching it requires a minimum 35-mile round trip through the Wind River Range wilderness with glacier travel, crevasse risk, and technical climbing on the summit pyramid. There are no roads within 20 miles of the trailhead that significantly reduce the approach. The peak is named for Henry Gannett, the chief geographer of the United States Geological Survey, who mapped more of the American West than perhaps any other individual. Gannett Peak holds the largest glacier in the Rocky Mountains, Gannett Glacier, which has been retreating measurably since the 1920s. Wyoming's tallest mountain is the hardest summit in the lower 48 to reach, holds a disappearing glacier, and is named after the man who mapped the country at Anchors.